your knowledge and your great talk. Now, Adrienne is the co-host, so you can share your slides.
I didn't make any slides.
Okay, that's fine.
So you just get me.
You know, that's fine. That is perfect. You are what we're here for.
Well, in the time that I agreed to do the talk, and now I became a single mom, and so my life has become very hectic, and so the prospect of doing the slides just seemed daunting. So you just get me.
You know what? You are more than enough. You are what we want. You are what we're here for. So please, you have an interesting talk title. Now I forget it off the top of my head, so I'm going to have to check my program. So yeah, Jane Boleyn, Challenging the Myths, a reassessment of her historiography. So I am really excited to hear you talk about her. So I'm going to just turn it over to you. Okay.
Okay. All right. So I'm going to preface it by saying I'm like really nervous. This is the first talk I've ever given. So you guys are like my first. So I'm going to go ahead and minimize my camera so that way I can start talking and I won't get distracted by all your lovely faces. Okay, here we go. Fake news. It's the watchword of the day, right? The social media machine makes it hard to avoid. Anyone can upload a story, share it to their page, one that can look completely legitimate as a news source, and before you know it, it has gone viral. How do you know what's accurate anymore? Who do you trust? We tend to think of this as a modern concept, a radical tool deployed by warring political factions. But fake news has been around since long before Facebook and Twitter. The people of the past knew it as propaganda, and no one knew how to better wield it than the leading figures of the Tudor age. Queen Elizabeth herself was propaganda personified. The Virgin Queen was a carefully crafted persona created by the monarch to hide the woman's very real human flaws, and later, her aging body. So, what does this have to do with Jane Boleyn? Well, she too has become propaganda personified, a cruel caricature of the real woman buried beneath centuries of myth and slander. Today, I'm going to talk about the origins of some of those myths and try to brush off the dirt that has been thrown her way in the hopes of revealing the truth about this enigmatic woman. Jane's biographer, Julia Fox, traces the beginning of her subject's defamation to a man named George Cavendish. As I'm sure many of you know, Cavendish was one of Cardinal Wolsey's most faithful servants. You are likely familiar with the biography he wrote, celebrating the life of his beloved master, a work riddled with inaccuracies and misremembered anecdotes. But it is his poem, Metrical Visions, that sets the precedent for the joyful slander of Jane. Did he write it with that intention in mind? We don't really know. But he was biased against the Boleyns, blaming them for Wolsey's fall. What we do know is that the poem has been misinterpreted. The key here is the word poem. It was an allegory and not something to be taken at face value. Cavendish's poem is an excellent example of the morality tales so popular during the Tudor period. They were written to demonstrate the dangers of falling into sin and vice. They were intended to inspire their readers to godly behavior and respect for the law. In Visions, Cavendish condemns vanity and riches, lamenting the loss of chivalry. He blames wealth, ambition, and avarice for the downfall of the characters populating his work, and each is used to illustrate a particular sin. George Boleyn represents carnal sin, Henry Norris, ambition, Francis Weston, unchecked lust, William Brereton, malice, and Mark Smeaton, presumption. Jane is used to demonstrate dishonesty and infidelity. Knowing her ultimate fate, it makes sense that Cavendish would use her in this way. It was she who helped Catherine Howard in her extramarital liaisons, she who hid her affair. But again, these descriptions are allegorical. Cavendish uses the figures of people he knew to represent abstract or spiritual meanings. However, that didn't stop later historians from presenting these representations as fact. Enter another George, George Wyatt. His biography, The Life of Anne Boleyn, was the first of many to challenge the accepted perception of the murdered queen. Commissioned by the Archbishop of Canterbury, the work was intended as a response to the Catholic propaganda seeping out of the continent. Like Metrical Visions, it is a morality tale, but it is not allegorical and seeks to portray Anne as a Protestant martyr. With Queen Elizabeth still on the throne and proclaiming her proud Tudor lineage, it would have been unthinkable for Wyatt to place the blame of Anne's death where it rightly belonged. Elizabeth would have never countenanced such a charge against her father. As a Catholic with close ties to the late Queen Mary, an aunt to one of the leading exiled recusants, Jane was an easy target. And her involvement with Catherine Howard only made it that much easier to pin the blame upon her. Plus, Wyatt had the word of someone who witnessed her fall to back him up, George Cavendish. Who cared if his work was allegorical? It served to bolster Wyatt's claims about Jane, whom he called a wicked wife, accuser of her own husband, even to the seeking of his blood. From there, Wyatt's charges were embraced and seized upon by the printer commissioned to publish later editions of John Fox's Acts and Monuments. Though Fox himself never even mentioned Jane in the original work, the printer saw fit to castigate her in a marginal note on a later edition. He wrote, "It is reported of some that this Lady Rochford forged a false letter against her husband and Queen Anne her sister, by the which they were both cast away, which if it be so, the judgment of God is here to be marked." But reported by whom? The printer isn't even entirely sure of its veracity, and yet it is accepted as evidence of her so-called betrayal. This would not be the last time marginalia would bring shame to Jane's name. In a dispatch from French diplomat Antoine de Castelnau, there is a description of a protest that occurred at Greenwich in support of the Princess Mary. He describes a dramatic scene of weeping and crying. The women who participated were summarily sent to the Tower for their insubordination. A translation of the letter carries a marginal note. It says, "Milord de Rochefort et Milord de Guillaume." But what does that mean? So were they the leaders of the protest? No, that was impossible. Women were leading the charge. So it must have been their wives. The note is just too vague to derive its meaning. Additionally, there are issues with the translation of the letter. Were the women there at the behest of their husbands or in opposition to them? The various translations are in disagreement and literally turns upon one word. They aren't even entirely certain who wrote the letter. Was it Castelnau or Jean de Dintville, another French diplomat? With such murkiness, it is impossible to deduce what really happened or if the writer was even telling the truth. He recounts the event as a rumor rather than an eyewitness account. No matter, it is taken as gospel and added to the list of Jane's many faults. As an aside, Natalie Grueniger of On the Tudor Trail and Talking Tudors is actually working on a book about the last 2 years of Anne Boleyn's life. And she got the letter and is working with somebody on a translation. And yeah, so it's all very, very interesting. So you'll have to watch out for her book for more discussion on that. From George Wyatt, we are led to Lord Herbert of Cherbury and Bishop Gilbert Burnet. Without taking into consideration the biases either men may have had, and as an ardent Protestant, Burnet had many, we can easily pick apart their works for shoddy research. Had they looked into contemporary sources like John Hussey, the London contact for the Lisle family, or Justice John Spellman, a judge reporting on the trials in 1536, they would have discovered that the witnesses procured against Anne and George were the Countess of Worcester, Lady Bridget Wingfield, and Nan Cobham. There is not a single contemporary record that names Jane Boleyn. In fact, we don't even know for certain she was interrogated. It has been suggested that Lord Herbert was working from a lost chronicle written during Henry's reign. But for his charge that Jane testified against her husband and his family, he references his own book, which would be humorous if it wasn't so frustrating. Herbert may very well have used a contemporary journal now lost to time, but there is no way of vetting its accuracy without knowing what information the journal contained or who wrote it. It is possible that both Herbert and Burnet used a journal kept by Anthony, surveyor of the Ordnance of the Tower. Anthony was a contemporary witness and may have known the finer details of the interrogations. While it is true the account has been lost, we can thank the president of Corpus Christi College, Oxford, for taking such diligent notes in his study of it. With his help, we can recreate the pertinent passages. Looking at the transcripts, Jane's name is utterly absent from Anthony's reports on the trial. Another historian, John Snow, used this same journal to craft his Annals of the English. As expected, Jane's supposed role in her husband's downfall is nowhere in the work. For as much as Burnet derides Jane, he later contradicts himself by saying Mark Smeaton's confession was all that could be brought against Anne. So which is it? As an aside, Burnet's work is the most offensive. He calls Jane's later execution God's justice. But what justice can there be when a tyrant changes the law to exact his revenge upon a mentally unstable woman? There are two other pieces of evidence that have been used to slander Lady Rochford's reputation over the centuries, but they have been largely misinterpreted or outright twisted to fit a false narrative. The first is a manuscript written by Jean Lefebvre called The Lamentations de Matholius et les Livres de Lys, more commonly known as The Torments of Marriage and the Book of Gladness. This is a bound manuscript once owned by George Boleyn and now housed in the British Library. And I was very lucky to see it 2 years ago and hold it in my hands, and it's really quite glorious. Assumed to be a wedding gift upon George's marriage, the book originally belonged to Thomas Wyatt, and his commentary is still written all over the inside covers. Historian Retha Warnicki, who set forth the controversial theory that the men charged with Anne died because of their homosexual relationships, based her idea that the Boleyn marriage was a deeply unhappy one on the existence of this manuscript. Because the translation is of a poem lamenting the torment of marriage and the innate changeability of women, then surely it was meant as a commentary on George and Jane's marriage. This claim has, of course, been repeated over the ensuing years by other historians and is now firmly entrenched as a generally accepted fact. However, deeper literary analysis reveals that the manuscript is far more complex. In truth, the manuscript is made up of 2 volumes, the translation of the poem and Lefebvre's response to it. Far from agreeing with the author of the poem, Lefebvre refutes his charges and extols the virtues of both marriage and women. His arguments are rather feminist in nature, surprising for the time, and contradict the Lamentations. Wyatt's comments in the manuscript further illuminate his intention in gifting George the work. He inscribed, "My listeners, note well this point, that the new quashes the old way of thought." Suffering in his marriage, perhaps the manuscript was meant to serve as a warning to his dear friend. Your marriage can be full of gladness or misery. For his part, Wyatt seemed to take his misfortune in stride with his usual cutting sense of humor. My favorite inscription in the manuscript reads, "He that is an ass and thinks himself a hind on leaping a ditch will realize the truth. The other evidence can be traced to George himself. In the heat of his trial, he indignantly read out a charge that he and Anne had questioned the king's virility and ability to please a woman. Taken aback by the ridiculousness of the assertion, he brushed it off as nonsense. But it wasn't completely inaccurate. Anne had discussed her husband's impotence, not with her brother, but with his wife. Centuries later, this act of defiance would be twisted and used to support the idea that Jane had carried stories of the pair's taunting to Cromwell. The more likely scenario was that Jane was questioned under duress and relayed this private conversation only because she had no other option. The mere fact that Anne felt comfortable confiding in Jane points to something quite contrary to the accepted notion that the two women hated each other. As damaging as the twisted interpretations and biased works of the above historians are, there is another act far more sinister: forgery. The culprit, Gregorio Leti, and I'm sure Rebecca Larson is very familiar with old Leti. Writing in the 17th century, his most well-known work is a biography on Queen Elizabeth. Yet another Protestant, his work is largely sympathetic to both the Virgin Queen and her mother. However, it is filled with completely fabricated letters from Elizabeth to a host of characters, including her sister Mary, Thomas Seymour, and Robert Dudley. Leti presented his work as history, but he was first and foremost a satirist and had no qualms about making up sources and inventing tales. One of these inventions has continued to dog Jane since its creation: a scaffold speech in which she admits to giving false testimony against her husband and cries out for her richly deserved punishment, a speech which is utterly fake. Ironically, most modern historians reference Leti's penchant for the dramatic, but then they inexplicably use his forgery to condemn Jane. It's just too tempting. They love the idea of a villain. Thankfully, this confession is easily disproven thanks to a letter written by a London merchant on the day after her execution. On February 15, 1542, a man named Otwell Johnson wrote to his brother at Calais describing the extraordinary scene he witnessed the day before at the execution of the Queen and her lady. He says, "I see the Queen and the Lady Rochford suffer within the Tower the day following, whose souls, I doubt not, be with God, for they made the most godly and Christian's end that ever was heard tell of, I think, since the world's creation, uttering their lively faith in the blood of Christ only, and with goodly words and steadfast countenances, they desired all Christian people to take regard unto their worthy and just punishment with death. With death for their offenses against God, heinously from their youth upward, in breaking all his commandments, and also against the king's royal majesty, very dangerously. Wherefore they, being justly condemned, as they said, by the laws of the realm and parliament to die, require the people, I say, to take example at them for amendment of their ungodly lives, and gladly to obey the king in all things, for whose preservation they did heartily pray, and willed all people so to do, commending their souls to God, and earnestly calling for mercy upon him, whom I beseech to give us grace with such faith, hope, and charity at our departing out of this miserable world, to come to the fruition of his Godhead and joy everlasting. Amen." From this eyewitness testimony, we can prove with certainty that the final words Jane uttered had nothing to do with George's death or any assumed role in it. This speech is boilerplate, almost to the letter. As odd as it may seem to us today, it was customary for those on the scaffold to take on a penitent tone, conceding that they had offended both God and the monarch and thus deserved their fate. Not only were they attempting to save their surviving family members any additional punishment, they were also following a prescribed ritual of confessing their manifold faults and making a good end. From the moment of birth, the men and women of the 16th century were raised to believe that they were all sinners in the eyes of God. Voicing this belief on the scaffold was instinctual and put them one step closer to heaven. There is absolutely no reason to assume that Jane's confession of living an ungodly life was code for giving false testimony. She was simply stating her inherent sinful nature and commending her soul to God's care. Otwell Johnson's letter is a reliable source, not just because he saw the executions with his own eyes, but because there is no obvious agenda. He was a merchant, unconnected to anyone who may have had an interest in exonerating either of the condemned. His letter was to his brother, informing him of the news of the day. There was no religious or political bent, nor any reason to suspect he was repeating anything other than what he saw. So what else do we have besides Otwell Johnson's letter to disprove this portrait of a woman hell-bent on destroying her husband and his family? We have to go back to the primary documents, starting with Jane's jointure and reports of her inclusion in important events during her sister-in-law's reign. The description of Anne's coronation procession in Jane's honored position just behind the Queen, a place high above her station. Ambassador Chapuis's letter relaying her role in the dismissal of a woman challenging the king's affections, an effort which resulted in her exile. We have correspondence by Sir Edward Bainton referencing letters George received from his wife while on diplomatic assignment, discussing important court matters, and reports from Kingston referencing a hopeful and loving marriage from Jane to her husband in his doleful prison. After Jane's own death, we find an inventory listing her mourning clothes and marriage bed, its hangings wrought with Rochford knots, a reminder of her long dead husband. This bed is perhaps the best indicator of the affection between the two. When George was murdered, it had been confiscated by the king. Jane successfully petitioned to have it restored to her and never parted with it, even though she could have used the proceeds during her financially lean years. Additionally, we have the Latin Bible formerly belonging to Jane's brother, Henry. In it, he lists the godparents of his children. George is named godfather to Henry's eldest daughter, Alice, a high honor for someone supposedly on the outs with his wife and her family. Just as important are the things you won't find in an archive. Search high and low, and you will find no references to Jane in the trial records, beyond George reading aloud from that strip of paper. You will find no denigrations of the couple or their marriage from other courtiers or diplomats. Even Ambassador Chapuis reluctantly found George rather charming when he wasn't preaching the gospel. There is no contemporary commentary on their relationship, which means it was unremarkable. If you've read my novel, you know that I personally interpret their marriage as filled with deep and abiding affection, but that need not necessarily be the case. All evidence points to a respectful and compassionate union at the very least. I'm sorry. I had an email pop up and it went over what I was reading. When historians can bring themselves, so all evidence points to a respectful and compassionate union at the very least. When historians can bring themselves to recognize this, the very fabric of Jane's undeserved reputation begins to unravel at the seams. The examples I have presented here are just a small sampling of the many myths that persist about the ill-fated Lady Rochford. Though many of the conclusions these sources draw about the lady can be refuted, the works as a whole need not be dismissed. They provide value in other ways, illuminating the prevalence of propaganda in the ensuing centuries and the power various religious sects wielded in influencing public perception and acceptable human behavior. They also teach modern audiences how to recognize the same tactics in our own purveyors of information. Whether it is outwardly evident or not, we face inherent bias every time we click on an article or share the latest viral video. Something really good to keep in mind, especially this time of year. Thank you so much.